Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for having me on this presentation, and also thank you to Helen. I mean, I'm still a little bit out of breath from listening to your presentation. It was very, very concise and fast-firing action, so very well done. My topic is not as exciting. It's much more humble and simple. I also I must apologize, I do not have a presentation to go along with. So I'm just going to talk for a while on the sample collection, and then if there's still some time left, I will also talk about the Nagoya Protocol. The sample collection is of course very, very difficult. I mean, what Helen shared with us about the monographs being put together, how they're being put together and for what purpose, is of course very, very much dependent on a good sample, and not only on one sample, but a spread of samples from the botanical raw materials that we're talking about at the moment. So the more samples we have, the more we also can understand the variability of a raw material. And it is very, very important to make sure that we actually capture that variability, so that that's also reflected in the monograph, and that the monographs are then also defined in a way that it's not too narrow, so that there are ranges of active ingredients, for instance, or of the active ingredients, really, what is allowed and what can we expect when looking at a botanical raw material. I'm referring actually to a standard operating procedure, an SOP that was shared by Eike, who's also here, which is actually from the HPTLC Association. And that goes into very much detail. So I'll just sort of walk through the document a little bit and pick up on some of the points from there. It is very important when we collect samples for pharmacopoeia research and definitions and analysis, that we know where the raw material comes from. So we can't just simply rely on hearsay or somebody saying, oh, I've got the real thing here. We need to actually verify the source where it comes from. And the more we know about the resource, the better it will be. The more we know about the source that we get the material from, the better it will be. And everything that I'm talking about now is best to record and create documentation around as much as possible. After all, Helen was also mentioning, thank you, David. Yes, that's the document I'm referring to. We're talking a pharmaceutical. The USP is a pharmaceutical pharmacopoeia, so we are talking very much about GMP, the good manufacturing practice, or in colloquial terms, give me paper. In other words, give me documents where you can prove what you're saying is actually correct and that you've done the right thing. So, as I said, the sources can be different. In the document, it talks about markets, for instance, or growers, suppliers. As long as you make sure that the material is actually correct and that what your source, what your seller or your collector tells you is actually verifiable and can be positively identified. Paperwork is very important to go along with it. We need to know what the scientific name is. The common names are interesting, but as we know, they can be misleading because a common name can be used in different areas for different plants, and that could have a very fatal results. I mean, I'll just give you one quick example from the Second World War in Europe. There were two plants that were called dandelion in colloquial German. The one was the well-known Taraxacum officinale, which is actually a very good also dietary supplement. It stimulates digestion, and it can be in an early stage of the plant development, it can actually be used as a in addition to a salad. So in the times of the Second World War, where people didn't have too much to eat, it was promoted that people should go out and collect this plant, which grows in many places as a weed. But the common name for the taraxacum was also used for another plant, which was Convallaria maialis, and those that knows what this is the lily of the valley, and this is a highly toxic plant. So when people went out and collected this and started consuming it, there were a few adverse drug reactions and unfortunate deaths to report, until the authorities then said, well, just let's rather stop this kind of a practice, which shows you that common names can be very, very misleading, and it is better to refer to the botanical name, the scientific name. So what we also need to make sure is that when we harvest the sample and procure the sample and process the samples, we eliminate or at least record all parameters that could have an impact on the quality of the plant material. And when I say quality, I'm not only referring to the looks, whether it turns brown during drying or so, but also to the ingredient levels and the ingredient profile inside the plant that we want to test and build up the Pharmacopeia monograph on. So all factors that can have an impact on the composition of the plant material need to be considered and need to be recorded, and where necessary also be mitigated. Typical factors that have an impact on the quality is, for instance, the time of year where the plant is collected. Is it a mature plant? Is it a young plant? Is it the young leaves or old leaves? Or that has a huge difference on the composition of the raw material. So the harvesting conditions, when are you harvesting the plants? You should record the date. The time when you started harvesting, was it 7 o'clock in the morning or was it at lunchtime? I mean, we all know when we pick a bunch of flowers at 6 o'clock in the morning, they will last longer than if you plant them at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the bright sun. So this has always, these kind of variations need to be taken care of, and you also need to record that. So if you only can harvest during midday, you should just record it that was just the case, so that one knows if there is a deviation from other plant material that one is looking at, and one knows maybe it was just the wrong time of day that it was harvested. Then one shouldn't harvest during rain or adverse weather conditions. Rain will obviously render the plant moist, and then it will dry slower, and it will have a potentially negative impact on the quality of the material. One important thing also what Helen mentioned is adulteration, and adulteration is there are many forms of adulteration. You can collect the wrong species or something that looks alike. Yeah, so contamination is, to avoid contamination is very, very important. Then one should look at healthy plant specimens so that they're not tainted by disease, by fungal infections, for instance. We know aflatoxins can be then present, or other substances that are not desirable and may just very much impact on the analytical result, especially if you put that into an HPLC. You will suddenly have some extra peaks which are difficult to explain. So one needs to be very careful. Also, if you have insects in there, that could just be detrimental to the sample quality. Underground parts, roots, obviously, we need to be careful that we actually only harvest the roots from the plant that we are looking for. We must also remember that root can be very much tangled with other roots from plants growing close to it or next to it. So one needs to be a little bit aware of that kind of a thing and make sure that one only has the roots of that plant that you're looking for. And you need to get rid of the soil. Any leftover soil will also have a negative impact on the analysis. So that means you need to be washing the plant material, and you need to carefully then dry the water off. Then there's a little bit of a difference if you're harvesting samples from the wild or from the cultivation, in the sense that when you are able to access plants from cultivation, you have a lot more information available, hopefully from the source of the cultivation, the horticulturalist or the farmer, where you get it from. They should be able to give you some ideas of when the plants were sown, when they were transplanted, was artificial fertilizer used or organic fertilizer, how old are the plants, what is were there any pesticides being used? If there were pesticides used, obviously that will also have a negative impact, and you will also suddenly sit with some extra peaks in your analysis. So you have to be somewhat careful there. But as I said, from cultivation, one normally should be able to get more data. And also sometimes you're dealing nowadays with cultivars of plants that have gone through a selection and breeding process. So there you need to just find out what they are, because they often, medicinal plants have been selected and bred for specific characteristics, high level of or low level of certain ingredients, and we need to know that. The identification of the plant material, of course, is also very important. I mentioned earlier on that we need to have the proper botanical name, the binomial Latin name recorded. If we are unsure, then we should actually take a sample and take it to a botanical garden where it can be identified without any shadow of doubt. For that, it is most of the time important to have the plant flowering, because the flower, as we all know, is very much a distinguishing feature of the plant. And also species can be separated by the shape and size of color of flowers, etc. You should actually prepare some voucher specimens. When you collect the plants, take 1 or 2 or 3 beautiful examples of the flower and press them. You can use newspaper for that, and put some heavy books on there or so, and keep changing the newspaper so that you avoid fungi and mold growing on it. It needs to be quite well ventilated, and also the drying should be going as quickly as possible. And if possible, you then mount that herbarium specimen onto a sheet of paper or cardboard so that you have a record of what you have done. For wild harvest, obviously, it is also important to give a location description. We're talking a GPS, but we're also talking, has the plant been growing in the shade next to a river? What are the associated vegetation look like? Are we in a forest? Are we in a savanna? Are we in a wetland, or whatever that is? Useful information that one can record and should be available. Then, in terms of post collection processing, in other words, what happens once you have picked your roots, your herbs, your leaf, your seed? They need to be processed in a way that the quality and the ingredient profile remains intact. So if you need to dry that, like with most of the plant material, you should do that away from light. If you have a little oven, an incubator oven, for instance, would be suitable. You set the temperature at about 40 degrees and plenty of air so that you're not creating too humid conditions where, again, fungi or mold could grow. You pack your plant material not too tight and not too thick on your trays. You make sure that there's sufficient aeration and airflow over the plant material so that they actually can dry as quickly as possible. I also forgot, when you're collecting the samples, the container which you use for collecting should allow the plant material to evaporate some liquid already. So it could be a paper bag, it could be a crate, it could be a basket. One should avoid, where possible, plastic bags unless you have a very short and quick transport period from your location where you harvest to the place you're drying. Obviously the tools and the transport containers should be clean. You should make sure that there's no leftovers from any previous crops or previous plant material being carried or transported in those containers. Labeling is very, very important. So when you collect your plants, you should have a sheet where you record all sort of data that are mentioned just now, and date, temperature, weather, location, what plant, etc., and then create an appropriate label afterwards. I have unfortunately had my own experiences where we didn't label things properly, and then sometimes once they are dry, you can't really distinguish anymore which is which, and you may have a repeat action to get some more sample again. Then storage is, of course, also very important. I mentioned the storage container already. So when you transport your plants, your samples from the harvesting site to where you're drying it, it should be not be able to sweat in a plastic bag. It shouldn't be in the sun, which then creates perfect conditions for fungi and microbes to grow. So avoid that. Keep it cool, keep it in the shade, and once you've got it at home or at your laboratory, just unpack it very quickly and get it dry. The packaging also, once the material is dry, and or let's say the material needs to be dry, and you can test that, of course, if you have the equipment. You can measure the moisture content. The moisture content ideally is well below 10%, 8%, 9%. Sometimes it can also be 12%, but the lower the better, which doesn't mean that you should dry it to absolute dryness. So below 5% is often not so good. So in our practice, we try to actually aim for the 8 to 9% of moisture, residual moisture in the dried plant. Yeah, then I think that's most what I can say here. Just make sure that your samples are also homogeneous as possible. And any observation that you have during harvesting, during processing, during packing, that could have an impact on your quality of the ingredient and of the plant material should be recorded. Even if it's an oopsie moment where you say, "Oh, damn, I left it too long in the oven," then write that down. That one actually has that information, so that if you have a non-typical ingredient profile or non-typical looking plant material, you know where that comes from, and you can actually judge that. What is also important is that one sample is not sufficient. So you should have a number of different samples that you can actually then analyze separately. So, as I said in the beginning, that you can actually set the range of what the plant material should look like. We know that, for instance, I mean, some plants, Lipia javanica, has got essential oil content which varies from, I mean, tremendously. I mean, I've seen Lipia javanica populations, but within a population, you had variations. Some plants I found once were smelling like cinnamon, and the plants next to it were just smelling like Lipia, like lemonish. So one needs to be aware of that and needs to take appropriate number of samples, 3 to 5 or more samples that then are analyzed and thus create a range of products. When I say you should take more than one sample, you should take them from distinctly different locations, not from 5 meters down the path where you've harvested just now, but you should, ideally, if it's wild harvested, go to the other side of the mountain, for argument's sake, or just try and get a few kilometers between this location and the next one, so that you get a distinct genetic makeup, or the potential of that it's all the same kind of thing is avoided. If there is a variation in the plant material, a genetic variation, a couple of kilometers between the sample site would be very useful. If one knows from experience that the plant is very different at different times of the year, then it may be useful to have that reflected as well, maybe a spring, summer, and autumn sampling. That, of course, it depends very much on the plant that you are harvesting. I think that's more or less it.
If I let you talk, Uli, you will just go on the whole day, because I know you're a man who loves plants, and you've actually shared a lot of things that we don't take into consideration. So thank you very much. We will now have questions for both Uli and for Helen. And then after this, we're going to do a quick fire. And when I say quick fire, we've got like 5 minutes to visit a few countries in Africa.